Morning, ACSE. I'm sure many of you have noticed, but Christmas has arrived early at ACSE. In the spirit of that season and all the holly that is going to adorn the hallways here pretty soon, I'm pleased to introduce our guests for this Commandant Speaker Series. Danielle Shields is a member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of Minister Counselor and currently serves at the U.S. Army War College, where he's been since January 2015. Prior to his time at Carlisle, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Brunei. His overseas assignments include Deputy Chief of Mission at U.S. Embassy Singapore, Political Minister Counselor and Political Officer at U.S. Embassy Beijing, Political Section Deputy and Political Officer at U.S. Embassy Tokyo, Principal Officer for the U.S. Consulate in Nagoya, and Consular Officer at U.S. Embassy at Manila. No stranger to Washington, D.C., Ambassador Shields has served in a variety of positions within the State Department as well, including Director of the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia, Economic Deputy in the Office of China and Mongolia, Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and as a Desk Officer for Cambodia. Ambassador Shields received a Bachelor of Science degree from Georgetown University and a Master of Science degree from the National War College. He's joined on stage today by Miss Mary Avery, currently on assignment as the State Department Senior Advisor to Air University. Miss Avery has been a member of the U.S. Foreign Service for 24 years with the rank of counselor, the majority of which has been in Asia and Washington, D.C. She also is a graduate of Georgetown University and the National War College. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Shields and Miss Avery to ACSE for what promises to be a fascinating hour.
Okay. Good morning, Ambassador, and thank you all for having us today. Ambassador Shields is just visiting us for a really short visit here, and we're very glad that we could come over and share his expertise with you all. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you again for coming down and sharing your practitioner's perspective on the diplomatic instrument of power. I'd like to ask you to share a little bit about your previous visit to Maxwell.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. It's really a great honor and privilege to be with all of you today and have this opportunity to talk about diplomacy. So I understand this is your Christmas present. You must not have been very good this year. No, I've been here to the Air War College one time before. It was in 2001 when I was a student at National. And I came for the Joint Land Air Sea Seminar, JLAS exercise, and that was a fascinating experience for me. The thing that I really enjoyed about JLAS is that we got to look at the United States military and the United States government from the perspective of other countries. And I think they've changed the way they do it a bit now. But I found that a fascinating exercise to think, all right, if we were another government and we had to get into a military conflict with the United States, what would the challenges be? And it was a fascinating perspective. The reason I bring that up is that it really was very useful for me in developing what people are talking about as strategic empathy, this ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other party. In this case, it might be an adversary. In another case, it might be an ally or a partner. But just to understand how we look to them, what they want, what their perspectives are. And I recently heard a senior U.S. diplomat giving a presentation, and he said that he thinks that kind of strategic empathy is actually the most important quality for strategic leaders to develop. So I just wanted to share that idea with you. I think it's a useful insight. In terms of the presentation today, as you notice, there's no PowerPoint. State Department people don't do PowerPoint generally. The ones who do it are not very good at it, and we just thought we'd give you a break from that kind of PowerPoint thing. I do want to say that I'll be sharing my personal opinions. I'll be sharing some kind of personal experiences relating to the diplomatic instrument of power. I won't be representing official U.S. government policy, so it would be the usual not for attribution. I know everybody's thinking about the next administration, Unfortunately, I don't have any particular insights that I can share about next administration and what they'll do on the controversial issues of the day. But anyhow, with those caveats and kind of the ground rules, let's go to some. First, Mary will ask me some questions, and then we'll open the floor.
Okay. I'd like to start out with just a really basic question of how would you define diplomacy? What is diplomacy to you?
So with regard to diplomacy, I think it's always useful to start this kind of conversation with reference to what is the commonly understood dictionary definition of the word. Webster's dictionary says diplomacy is the art and practice of conducting international relations, as in negotiating alliances, treaties, and agreements. That's meaning number one. Meaning number two is tact and skill in dealing with people. And I think those two meanings of the word actually can create a little bit of confusion. Today, we're certainly talking about it in the first sense of the word, about the conducting international relations, not the second sense of the word in terms of being tactful and skilled in dealing with people. I think you'll find a whole range among diplomats in terms of how tactful they are or how skilled they are in dealing with people. But it's that first sense that we need to talk about today. Another element that I didn't see in the dictionary definition, but that I think is really fundamentally important in talking about diplomacy is the element of persuasion. As I see it, diplomacy is not just the practice of international relations, but also the practice of persuading other governments to take or refrain from taking actions. And of course, this has to be in the context of advancing U.S. interests and also U.S. values. I think the diplomatic instrument simultaneously tries to make use of the other instruments of power, whether it's military, informational, or economic. But I think that the key element, from my perspective, is persuasion.
Do you think that there's and how would you describe it, if so, a hallmark to American diplomacy or the American practice of diplomacy that is unique or that comes from our particular circumstances and culture?
Yes, I think the American political culture, if you will, strategic culture, really does influence American diplomacy. As we were talking about earlier, American diplomacy, we generally talk about it in terms of interests and values. Certainly the traditional textbook concept of diplomacy would be about advancing interests. But certainly for the time that I've been serving in the Foreign Service since I came in 85, it's very much about U.S. values as well as interests. And I think there are a few Americans who would subscribe to the really traditional realist perspective that diplomacy should only be about advancing interests and not necessarily values. That has some implications that I don't think many Americans are prepared to accept. So that comes with advantages and disadvantages. The fact that the United States will put a high value on things like advancing democracy, human rights, religious freedom. In certain contexts, that's going to be a disadvantage, at least in the near term, for U.S. diplomacy. Other governments that don't share those values or don't care very much about those values will probably be able to get some near-term advantage in advancing their interests. But when we do stand up for those values, and then if it leads to a situation where there's a transition, the people in that country who do value democracy, human rights, and religious freedom will often remember where the United States was at that time. And I'm thinking there of the recent political transition in Burma or Myanmar, where for many years we, in a kind of sometimes lonely case, although certainly with support from allies like the UK and Australia, spoke out in support of Aung San Suu Kyi, the democratic leader in Myanmar. Meanwhile, China was vigorously pursuing all sorts of economic and other initiatives with the military regime. So it looked for a long time like the United States was shooting itself in the foot by standing on these values. But then in the end, there was kind of a change of heart on the part of the military regime, empowered the democratic leader to engage again in the political process after she completed her house arrest. So I think the fact that we stood up for our values did put us in a favorable spot.
Great. And the students here are looking at security, and they've come out of strategy, looking long and hard at strategy. Talking about instruments of power, how do you see the diplomatic and the military instruments of power working together?
Well, one thing I admire about the military educational system for strategic leaders is really is this serious educational emphasis on getting all of you, and Mary and I benefited from this kind of education as well, but to think seriously about how to integrate the various instruments of power and how you can use diplomacy to advance military instrument, or in our case, how we can use the military instrument to advance diplomatic objectives. It certainly cuts both ways. With regard to diplomacy, there are countless instances in which the military instrument of power has provided leverage for American diplomats. In some cases, that's positive. For example, we might be able to offer a country access to a weapons system that they might not otherwise get. Or it might be negative. Look at Richard Holbrooke's diplomacy in the Balkans, where he's practically calling in airstrikes as a way to exert pressure on the parties with which he was negotiating. So clearly, diplomacy relies in many instances on the military instrument of power. But it goes the other way, of course. In terms of what diplomats can do for military officers, many times it's in the area of helping to secure support from coalition partners, allies and other partners. It might be, for example, if there's a coalition, persuading other countries to join the coalition, or provide financial support for a coalition, or provide information that we may need. There are many ways that the diplomatic channel can help support military activities.
So what would be a best practice or something for them to think about as moving into these kinds of positions for engaging with America's diplomats to advance their missions? What would be some specific?
Right. My main suggestion would be that as you work on planning in a military context, and you look at certain effects that you're trying to achieve, particularly as you're going operational or strategic level, think about how you can use diplomacy to help achieve those effects. Because if you don't do that, it's very difficult for others on the diplomatic side to understand what the needs might be. I'll give you an example. When I was the U.S. ambassador in Brunei in Southeast Asia, we had a lot of senior U.S. leaders, military side and other side, passing through Brunei, largely because Brunei was the chair in 2013 of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, meetings. So we got a lot of senior visitors, pretty much everybody up to the president, although the president had to cancel at the last minute. But the defense, because of the government shutdown. But we had, all the cabinet secretaries and so on, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Secretary Hagel, they were all passing through, PACOM commanders. But the one thing that we found is both sides were quite interested at that time in exploring ways to expand U.S.-Brunei military-to-military cooperation. But the difficulty was figuring out what it is that we were asking the Bruneians to do. And sometimes our visitors would ask me, well, what should we ask for? And I would do my best to come up with something, maybe jungle training, but I didn't really know. So I think that's, and okay, this is Brunei, a small country. Maybe that was a factor in the difficulty there. But even with China, I'll cite an example. I was recently in a conference at the Army War College on the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and there were a lot of PLA experts in the room, and many of them had a military background, many of them had a diplomatic background. And the common thread of frustration was that we didn't have clear asks to take to the PLA in terms of what they could do that would facilitate a better relationship between the U.S. military and the PLA. We just didn't know. We didn't know what the question was. So that's what I would encourage you, is to think about what you can ask for from other governments and how you can use the diplomatic instrument to pursue that.
So sometimes we hear in the media and here in the United States, the awareness of what diplomats do is not very widespread. And some folks might say, I mean, why do we need diplomacy? It doesn't do any good, or it's irrelevant. I mean, how would you answer that? What would be your experience?
Right. So I think there is this kind of undercurrent of discussion about whether diplomats are irrelevant, and I think there are kind of two strains to it. There's one long-term distrust, I would say, in the American strategic culture about diplomats and diplomacy. It's like, does that really work? Let's use some hard power. Let's handle a problem that way. And I mean, this is kind of a silly example, but if you look at movies, right? The Americans get in trouble overseas. They go to the embassy looking for help, and what do the diplomats tell them? Sorry, we can't help you. Take a number. Maybe we'll help you later. That kind of thing, right? So there is that popular perception that diplomats are not helpful, not useful, right? So that's definitely something we're up against. There's also, I think, our country is not as aware of international affairs as we might like. I mean, you all see it in the military, where you come back from overseas or something and go back to your hometown, and you realize that a lot of people haven't had much exposure, right, to the outside world. When I tell people I work at the Department of State, many times they'll want to know what state, or or if I say I'm in the Foreign Service, they say, "Oh, Forest Service," So, it's just a reality. We have a vast country, and not everybody's thinking about international affairs all the time. So that's a challenge. So that's the longer term problem. I think in the nearer term, there was an article in Foreign Affairs in March by Alex Oliver entitled "The Irrelevant Diplomat," and his argument was, hey, we've had all this explosion in digital media, and when you look at that, and you look at the security problems that you have keeping up embassies, and you look at the limited resources that we devote to diplomacy in the first place, why even bother? Let's just accept that diplomacy is kind of irrelevant in the current environment. To me, Mary and I were talking about this earlier, but it's like when Ross Perot was running for president in 1992, and he said, well, we've got fax machines. Why do we need embassies? Why do we need diplomats? Well, let's send a fax, But the problem with that way of thinking, this idea that technology can be a substitute for diplomacy, is it doesn't really work, right? And just look at what recently happened in Turkey, for example, that the chaos in Turkey, the attempted coup, the demonstrations in the streets. I was watching that. Television reports, you just can't understand what's happening. And so I'm sure that the policymakers in Washington were burning up the wires to our embassy, just asking them for help in understanding what's happening, who's doing what to whom, who can we trust, who is on which side in this equation, and that's a dramatic example, but that's where embassies really add value, because a good embassy will have its people out there. There will be a good core who speak the language, who understand the culture, and not only that, but who get Washington, right, and who know what issues are going to be on the minds of Washington policymakers in that kind of situation. So I think that's a good example of, it's a dramatic example, but that's what embassies can do. Trust the people on the ground who get the local situation and get Washington. And that's the dramatic case, right, when there's tanks rolling through the street. But my argument is, in everyday life, too, that's what the embassy does. Right? This proliferation of digital media, it's a double-edged sword, right? There's plenty of information out there, but Washington doesn't know what it can trust. And that's what an embassy can help Washington sort through.
And speaking of that in a very practical sense, like even when it's not chaotic, when it's not, as you said, the tanks rolling in the streets, what are some just basic ways of understanding how to network, how to get that information from the diplomatic sphere into the military sphere?
Right. So I think that's kind of a good news story for you and for us on the diplomatic side as well, is there's been a real proliferation of good channels of communication. I mean, many of you who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, you worked with, in some cases, with Foreign Service officer counterparts in PRTs and that sort of thing. So we've got those sort of informal networks. The other thing that's really increased is the Foreign Policy Advisor, POLAD, system. Right? We have a lot more POLADs spread around the U.S. military in various capacities than previously. The important qualifier I would add with regard to POLADs is there are advisors, right? So talking to the POLAD is not a substitute for talking to the State Department, which is the lead foreign affairs agency, or the agency overseas. So when things go wrong, properly in the loop about what would happen. Country. There is an integrated country strategy where the ambassador and the embassy team try to pull together a strategic plan. And the SDO can make sure that the strategic planning efforts of the embassy are consistent with the strategic planning efforts of the combatant commander. It's not like one is under the other. They're two separate processes, but they have to be coordinated. They can't be contradictory. And the SDO can help make sure that that's the case.
So getting back to diplomatic practice, and aside from theory, I think one way that we all learn is through stories and hearing your stories. So you've served in some really interesting places, starting with the Philippines was your first assignment overseas, and at a very interesting time. Can you tell us a little about that?
Right. So I don't want this to just degenerate into my regaling you with stories from my past. As fascinating as that might be for me, but the reason that I do want to share some stories though is because in the end, people like Mary and I are practitioners, right? So our value added lies in our experience, and so if we can take the kind of theoretical discussion that we're having today and then ground it in actual experience, I think that's where we can add some value. So that's what I'm trying to do in taking the discussion in this direction. So the case of the Philippines, 1986, people power. Some of the older folks may remember it. Some of the younger folks, this might be something in the history books. But to me, it's an interesting example of one of the ways that the United States can use the diplomatic instrument of power to help achieve a peaceful political transition in a country where the stakes for the United States are always high, even today. So 1986, Marcos' regime was tottering. Marcos had come in as a dynamic young reformer, been in power a long time. she had competed in these elections, and according to the relatively objective observers, she had won the election, but Marcos had not recognized the results. So the interesting thing for me was I was just a very junior officer, first tour, vice consul, out issuing visas or denying visas out on the visa line. And but because this sort of crisis, people out in the streets, people power, demonstrating over the results of the election, the more senior leadership was just fading after this had gone on for days and days. So they brought me and some of my other more junior colleagues in just to help out. So I ended up in the ambassador's office that night that everything was happening, February 25th. And our ambassador, Stephen Bosworth, a great career diplomat, recently passed away. But it was a real education for me to watch this veteran, experienced, sharp diplomat just work the telephones to all the players and essentially help broker the deal that led to Marcos being able to leave peacefully. So he was talking to George Shultz, Secretary of State, Paul Laxalt, a senator from Nevada who was President Reagan's special envoy for the Philippines. He was talking to Marcos, he was talking to Cory Aquino, he was talking to Enrile, who was the defense secretary at the time, Ramos, who was number 2, a uniformed military leader. He talked with all of them and basically brokered the deal. So that night, U.S. Military helicopter went into the Malacañang presidential palace, picked up Marcos and his wife Imelda and some of the shoes, flew to U.S. Embassy out by Manila Bay, on from there to then Clark Air Base, and then fixed-wing aircraft took them to Hawaii that night. So this diffused what could have been a disastrous situation in a country that's very important to the United States. So that's one way that the diplomatic instrument of power can be used to advance U.S. interests.
Another example that is more recent and also more focused on the military interaction with the military instrument might be when you were in Japan, and in the early 2000s with the Iraq War was beginning.
Right. So so on this one, what I'd like to illustrate here is the way that the diplomatic instrument can be used to support U.S. Military activities. And this is a classic kind of coalition building story. So, as the Iraq War was beginning, we were very anxious to get support from coalition partners around the world. And I know many of you saw many pieces of that effort. I happened to be at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo at that time, and we were very keen to get Japanese support. Bringing and this was a hard lift for the Japanese because they had not had a military deployment outside Japan except under a UN umbrella since World War II. So this was really difficult politically for the Japanese. And in the end, their function, the self-defense force going to Iraq, it wasn't really for a military function, right? It was a kind of humanitarian effort, but it was also political symbolism, right? That the United States has support from a coalition around the world, including a country like Japan. And the key player on this was our ambassador there, Howard Baker, and he's the late Howard Baker. He is a legendary political figure and a political appointee ambassador. A lot of people talk negatively about political appointee ambassadors, and I'm not a fan of all of them myself. But someone like that is an example of a great political appointee ambassador. So he didn't know a lot about Japan. He didn't speak Japanese, but he was a consummate politician, and he was able to figure out who in the Japanese system could deliver, who could get Japan to deploy. And so he worked mainly with the Chief Cabinet Secretary Fukuda, who later went on to become Prime Minister. But this is a good example. It was them sitting down in their respective offices and talking and finding out what the other side needed that made this happen. And there were things where I think probably if you looked at it from a purely military perspective, you think, why are we doing this? Like early days of the war in Iraq, the Japanese wanted to send a group out to visit. It was politicians from the Komeito party, and they were the junior partner in the coalition. And I'm sure the people out there who had to arrange this are like, why are we doing this, But it was vital to get that party support for the deployment, which again was seen by Washington as vital to enhance the international perception of legitimacy of the coalition operation.
Great. An area of the world that you've spent a lot of time in is Southeast Asia. And of course, I assume if ACSC is anything like the Air War College, there's a lot of talk about South China Sea issues and about Southeast Asia these days. So I wondered if you could talk particularly about how the United States is using the diplomatic instrument of power in that region for stability.
So, yes, when I was ambassador to Brunei, as I was mentioning earlier, in 2013, Brunei hosted the ASEAN meetings. So we had a lot of leaders converging on Brunei. The thing about ASEAN is everybody, all the players kind of accept in principle that ASEAN should be the center of regional security efforts. So the United States will say things like that. The ASEAN certainly say it. The Chinese will say it. Everybody will say it. But what had happened in 2012 when Cambodia was the ASEAN chair is that the Chinese had really pressured Cambodia not to issue the traditional statement on South China Sea issues. So ASEAN as a group just said nothing on South China Sea. We were concerned about that, given the U.S. interest in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation, et cetera. So we worked hard with the Bruneians to encourage them to issue a statement on South China Sea. And more important, to hold ASEAN together as the chair. Because when ASEAN fragments, this whole idea that ASEAN can play a central role in regional security, it just becomes unrealistic. So the Bruneians did it. Brunei is a unique place. They have sultan, absolute monarchy, but they understood the importance of preserving ASEAN cohesion. Not only did they ensure there was a good discussion on South China Sea and put out the statement on it, but they also did things like rolling out a 5-year, $25 million Brunei-funded program to do English language education within ASEAN, because ASEAN doesn't have a common language. English is the only common language that ASEAN has as a working language. So by building up the English language side, they were able to strengthen ASEAN cohesion. So I think there's a case where the diplomatic instrument of power was helpful in building the cohesion of a group like ASEAN, which is important to the regional stability.
And I think one thing I've heard you say is that one reason that the Cambodians, when they had the leadership of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, this 10-member group, was not able to resist that pressure from China was because of their linkages. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how that pressure, how we balance that in other places?
So, here the economic instrument of power really comes into play. So if you look at a country like Cambodia, they depend so much on China economically, and part of that is trade, and part of that is Chinese economic assistance. In the case of a country like Brunei, it's different. Brunei is a wealthy country, one of the top 5 or 10 in the world in terms of per capita GDP, basically because of oil and gas exports. So China doesn't have the kind of leverage on a country like Brunei that it has on a country like Cambodia. So that was very much a factor, and that I'm sure the various parties were looking at how the economic instrument of power came into play as well. And
then also, could you talk, you mentioned once before, I heard you talk about a specific example. It was a very specific example, but it showed how other countries' pressure can make it difficult for us to use our diplomatic instrument of power to advance our interests. And in Thailand, you had a situation with Victor Boot.
Victor Boot, yes. So I don't know if any of you have heard of or had any kinds of contact with a figure named Victor Boot, but he's a very notorious Russian arms dealer. There's actually a movie Nicolas Cage movie,
Yeah.
I think called like Lord of War or something like that. Loosely based on the Victor Boot story, but very notorious arms trafficker. And so in 2008, I believe, the U.S. DEA worked with the Thai authorities to get Victor Boot arrested in Thailand. And it was essentially a sting operation where DEA agents posed as Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC insurgents, and they convinced Victor Boot to come to Thailand to discuss selling missiles to the FARC that these supposed FARC, who are actually DEA, they said they were going to use these weapons to kill American officials. And so Victor Boot went to Thailand, tried to sell the missiles, promptly got arrested by the Thai. And then we submitted the extradition request asking for Victor Boot to be extradited to the United States, but nothing happened. The Thai, and at first we really couldn't figure out why it was taking so long or what was happening. But we later realized what was happening is the Russians were making a heavy, heavy push on the Thai not to extradite their Russian citizen, who's widely reported to have links to Russian intelligence, military, top leadership, not to extradite him to the United States. So it became just a tug of war with the senior officials on the U.S. side, senior officials on the Russian side, weighing in with the Thai, and us with our asking the Thai to send him to the United States, and the Russians asking them to hand him over to them. And it escalated to high levels. Eventually, and I don't know what instruments of power the Russians were using, I can only guess, but on the U.S. side, we were essentially using the diplomatic channel, appealing to alliance relationship, and appealing to the principle of the rule of law. And it took the Thai a while, but they did what we see as the right thing, and they sent him here. He was tried, convicted, and he's serving in Marion Penitentiary. But it's an interesting example. I mean, in terms of what the U.S. national interests were there, it was basically enforcing U.S. law. It was a law enforcement function, but it was a case of using the diplomatic instrument to support U.S. law enforcement efforts.
Can you talk about a time when the diplomatic instrument didn't yield the results?
Yes. And I think this is important to put out. The diplomatic instrument, it's extremely versatile. It can produce wonderful results, but there are many times when it just doesn't work, right? Where the diplomatic instrument just can't get the result that we want. And a good example of that would be the six-party talks, the efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So dealing with North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Ambassador Chris Hill was also the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. He was the lead U.S. negotiator. He was a protege of Richard Holbrooke, so he had kind of seen how Holbrooke did things in the Balkans, and he was anxious, I think, to make his own mark in terms of solving a really thorny diplomatic problem. He brought tremendous energy and initiative to the process. He worked extremely well in developing his relationships with his counterparts from the other five parties, particularly the Chinese, who usually hosted the meetings and who have a unique relationship with DPRK. And he worked extremely hard. It was very strategic. He had a lot of economic leverage, both negative and positive, that he was able to exert on the North Koreans. But in the end, the North Koreans just said no. They just refused to make the deal, and they said they'll take the sanctions, they'll forego the benefits, and they just won't do it. And I think that's a fundamental constraint of diplomacy, that although it can have a coercive element to it, if you're talking about sanctions or threats, but you can't really use diplomacy to force another government to do something if it really doesn't want to do it. And I think the six-party talks is an example of that. Now, what about going forward? We still have a big problem there, right? The North Koreans are marching ahead to try to develop nuclear weapons. So what are we going to do about it? And there are some people who have, over the years, talked about using the military instrument, but we all know that would be a very, very messy, very bloody way to try to address the problem. The economic instrument is already thoroughly engaged. We don't have anything left to sanction, really, in terms of North Korea. So I think in the end, although the diplomatic instrument of power has not worked after many years of effort, it's still probably the least bad option that we have going forward.
And I'll make this my last question to you, and then we can open it up to questions from the class. The State Department is the nation's oldest cabinet department. What do you see for the future of the practitioners of diplomacy, building on that legacy?
Right. So yes, I mean the State Department does have this legacy as oldest cabinet department. Pioneering American diplomats like Benjamin Franklin played a critical role in bringing about French support for the American Revolution, U.S. independence. So we do have that in many ways distinguished history, but nobody really cares about that, right? The question is, what is the State Department going to do going forward to solve national security problems for the United States? I think if we look at the Obama administration as it draws to a close, this was an administration that took diplomacy seriously and that made a lot of diplomatic efforts. And I would point to 3 cases where they had success in using the diplomatic instrument. Although where it goes in the next administration is who knows. The 3 examples I would point to would be Burma or Myanmar, where after the military regime released Aung San Suu Kyi, let her engage in political activities, and then she won the election, that we recognize that by, although we already had diplomatic relations, we fully normalized them. So for example, we had embassies, but we didn't have an ambassador. So we sent an ambassador out there. We lifted sanctions. Okay, we did things like that. And not only is Myanmar an important country, it's also one of the 10 countries in ASEAN. So in the past, we had real trouble engaging ASEAN as a whole because they'd say, well, we want to cooperate with the other 9, but not that one. We don't like them. And ASEAN would say, you deal with all 10 of us or forget it. And so that dynamic has ended now. We can work with all 10 ASEAN countries. So Myanmar is one example. Cuba, right? There's another example where for 50 years we tried sanctions and those sorts of approaches to isolate and pressure the Castro regime to change. It just didn't work, right? It just did not work. So the Obama administration decided to give diplomacy a try. So we're still pretty early in that, not close to the 50-year mark, but we'll see which approach works better. And then the other one, of course, was Iran nuclear deal. And there, in many ways, kind of a similar process to the 6-party talks in that we had other key partners, all, in addition to the United States, the other 4 permanent members of the Security Council. Germany was also involved, and Iran, of course, and worked out a deal in terms of rolling back what the Iranians were trying to do with regard to their nuclear program. But that one's highly controversial, so who knows where things will go in the future. But those show that, I mean, for people like Oliver talking about the irrelevant diplomat, actually, U.S. diplomacy has been pretty active and has actually solved some serious national security problems during the Obama administration. And when I say diplomacy, I'm not just talking about the State Department and the ambassadors and embassies. It's the president. Diplomacy is very much the president's prerogative. Just as he's the commander-in-chief militarily, under Article 2 of the Constitution, he's clearly in charge of U.S. diplomacy. So I think U.S. diplomacy has been very active during the Obama administration, and we'll see what goes forward. But in terms of state's future, it can only win public support if it proves effective in solving national security problems.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'd like to open it to the class for questions at this time for the next, our last 15 minutes with you.